want to welcome everyone to today's next part of our next series in the Partner Positive series for Neon One. We are exploring the different things that affect nonprofits, and I'm extremely excited about today's presentation from the folks from My Change Agent. They're going to give themselves a formal introduction when we get started, but I'm pretty excited because what this does is we try to pair experts in a wide variety of content and then showcase how that can practically apply to the larger Neon One ecosystem. So a few things on our next slide. What we're going to be able to see is actually who is Neon One when it comes to who's putting on today's presentation. One more click shows a really fun graphic, which is kind of our space motif, because what we're doing and designing is a larger ecosystem of technology and services to help mission-driven organizations like yourselves. On the next slide, in a practical way of what that actually means, is that our ecosystem has a few different things. Neon CRM is a popular constituent relationship management system that some of you may use, but we actually do a lot of other things than just that. Rallybound is a fantastic peer-to-peer fundraising platform that Cystic Fibrosis uses, Michael J. Fox Foundation uses. Arts People is a ticketing platform that theaters use. But today's focus is actually going to be on our Civic ORS client and case management system, because there's a lot of things that people do, but one of the ones that is needing to catch up pretty sorely is how we manage our programs. The very sensitive data, things that might be HIPAA or VOCA compliant that we need. Just if you have some personal information, even down to social security numbers, stuff like that, that we want to make sure that you're managing this in a way that drives impact and helps with your feedback loop. Storytelling is a big part of what we do. That's also why we provide other services like professional implementations, web design, as well as, most importantly to today, our larger ecosystem of certified consultants and software. Today, we're going to be hearing from one of our certified software consultants, but Neon has a larger ecosystem of curated integrations and people that we've worked with, that we put our stamp of approval on, that we're excited to work on when it comes to initiatives like capacity building. And this seems to be working because we've actually helped raise over $10 billion to date, serving more than 30,000 nonprofits. Getting into our next and final item from me is relating to our housekeeping. Somebody actually asked about the deck. Yes, we can provide that upon request. This is also something that is being recorded. You could follow up on our, I mixed up those slides. So we have a YouTube channel, and that should be under the YouTube icon, and then we will be following up, which is under the envelope. So definitely, if you are interested in learning more, we're definitely going to be following up. So with that said, going to hand it on over to the folks. We have Carolyn and Aaron from My Change Agent. Would love to hear a little bit about you folks, and am really excited for today's presentation, Engagement Proposal, how to get your staff, board members, volunteers, and program participants to say, I do, which is super important as we enter end of year time as well. And we will be making time for Q&A as well. So I'll be checking that out as we go through the presentation. Carolyn, Aaron, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tim. We appreciate it. Well, welcome everyone. We know your time is valuable, and Carolyn and I both appreciate you being here. Really quickly before we get started, we are a management consulting firm that works nationally within the United States. We do an awful lot around capacity building for nonprofits, and also do quite a bit of work in the human resources field with nonprofits as well. So we're excited to be here today to talk a little bit about an engagement proposal. And with that, we'll jump on in and talk about our key objectives for today. So, as many of you know, defining engagement in a world where technology rules is extremely important. I'm sure many of you feel like the word engagement is one of the huge buzzwords that's out there right now. So we're going to define that for you and give some clarity. and also around how stakeholder engagement affects your nonprofit sustainability and bottom line. And then I'm going to pass it over to Carolyn later on, and we're going to talk about developing a framework for measuring engagement within your organization. And Tim will help us tie that into how that works with Civic ORS. And then most importantly, we do want this to be fun and be interactive. So like Tim said, if you have questions, let us know, but we will definitely open it up at the end to see if you've got any thoughts or feedback. So for that, let's get started. So we've always got to have a little humor, because if you don't have humor, life is not any fun. So good old Dilbert says, before I make my decision, I'd like to ask you for your opinions. It's supposed to make you feel engaged. And do you actually plan to listen to us? I'm hoping it will look like it that way on the outside. So with that being said, we hope we can have a little fun this afternoon. All right, so engagement can have a lot of definitions. It can be an arrangement to meet or be present at a specified place and time. It can be a job or a period of employment, especially as a performer. It can be emotional involvement or commitment. And then it also can be a state of being in gear, but most importantly, engagement is all of those things. It's a hostile encounter between military forces, but for us today, we're going to focus on what it means for engagement within a nonprofit, which is obviously the emotional involvement or commitment that you have within an organization. Good old Merriam-Webster's great with definitions, and we don't want to not cite that source as well. We'll go ahead and jump in on the next slide. So when we talk about engagement, we need to take it one step further. It's to the extent to which stakeholders are being motivated to contribute to organizational success and are willing to apply that discretionary effort to accomplish tasks important to the achievement of the organizational goals. If those stakeholders are not motivated and willing to put forth that effort, then where is your organization? And I'm sure many of you have felt that when those things are not in lockstep, you have what we call disengagement. And we want to talk about that today and hopefully give you some action plans on how we can make that better. And if you move to the next slide, what we'll see is there's some statistics that you can consider when you look at engagement. So 45.5% of individual donors are retained from year to year. I don't know for many of you if that was about what you expected or if that's a shock, but as a nonprofit, you want those numbers to be higher year after year. You've got 38% of board members are engaged in individual fundraising work. And out of 5.4 staff in an average organization, 15% are devoted to individual fundraising. And only 11% of donors make reoccurring gifts. So I think looking at the statistics, we can see that we've got a good reason that we need to look at engagement within nonprofits. Because obviously, as well as those numbers can be, and when they need to increase, we obviously want them to. So in order to talk about statistics and engagement, we need to look at the parties involved. So when we move to the next slide, you're going to see that key stakeholders are absolutely crucial to a nonprofit success. And stakeholders can mean a lot of different things within your organizations. It's not just board of directors. It can be the executive directors and the staff that are working to move the work forward within the organization. It most definitely, key stakeholders are board members and everything that entails from fundraising and governance from the organization. You have volunteers that hopefully are either donating, more than likely their talent to move your missions forward. And then you obviously have your program participants, or those that are impacted by the work that you are doing and the service that you provide to your communities. You have your donors that are extremely crucial to your success. They're financially helping back what you're doing and move your mission forward financially. And then you've got your community advocates. They're the ones that publicly support you, believe in what you do, and they rely on you. And not to mention, between your community advocates, your board of directors, volunteers, actually all of these, those are wonderful sources of public relations for your organization. So when they're not engaged or they're not happy, that can have an impact on your organization. So when we look at that, we want to dive in a little bit deeper on the next slide. I know many of you are aware when you have lack of engagement, how it can affect many, many, many parts of your organization. So we're going to kind of move through this slide. I'll go in a kind of a circular format to walk through it. But when you have got your board, you've got issues when they're not clearly defined roles. They don't realize what the time commitment's going to be as a part of your board. They don't clearly understand what your nonprofit does or how you do it. I have worked with numerous nonprofits, and I can say firsthand that I have worked with some board members that think they know what the organization does, and they don't. And then obviously that impacts your communications effort. It affects your program support. They don't come to your meetings. They don't respond to communications. So whether that's phone, emails, when input's needed, the extra tasks go undone. I'm sure many of you have done it firsthand. We have board members in certain areas of expertise that you're hoping they're going to be engaged and help you. And then when they don't, those tasks go undone. And in some instances, key decisions where you need their input and their buy-in don't get made. So then obviously the next group I'll talk about is volunteers. Lack of planning on how to use them is a huge problem. One of the worst things that can happen is when you have someone that's excited and wants to volunteer their time, and you don't find an effective way to get them plugged in within the organization. What ends up happening more often than not is their interest wanes, and then you've had a lost opportunity. You also can run into not utilizing their strengths or involving them in their areas of interest, so they get disengaged. If they are asked to volunteer or spend their time in an area that they're not passionate about, especially when this is more than likely an unpaid opportunity for them, hence what a volunteer is, they don't want to stay with the organization. They don't want to become involved. When you don't respect their time. And what I mean by that is it can be a lot of different things. You tell them it's going to take 2 hours, it ends up taking 6. Or you ask them to get there at a certain time and you're not organized and things are not lined up the way that they should be. And then not to mention if you don't train them properly, it leads to frustration and then they don't know how they can be useful. So then obviously some of the effects of that is they are not able to programmatically support you. You can have decreased funding and you've got a poor reputation. They're one of the largest people that can go out into the community and sing your praises or not. And then when you've got lack of engagement with program participants, you've got programs that are not well executed. Overall, there's poor experience with staff or other stakeholders, and the desired outcome of your program or your service that or your initiative you were trying to provide doesn't happen. So then obviously some of those effects are you've got decreased enrollment, you've got a poor reputation with either other stakeholders or within the communities that you serve. You potentially have got funding gaps for programs because I'm sure some of you have funding that you have secured from other areas, but then some also charge fee for service within their nonprofits as well. So that can negatively affect your financial stability. And then when we move on to donors, if they don't see the value in their donation or the impact, they can become disengaged. They don't feel valued overall. Or they can honestly see in some instances the dysfunction in how the organization is operating. And if they're ever privy to that information. Sometimes that causes them to be disengaged, not want to donate, and honestly question whether or not the nonprofit that they're involved with is the right one. So those effects are lack of sustainability, lack of repeat funding, and again, it's a poor reputation. And then when we look at community advocates, if they're unaware of your organization or your program, how can they advocate for you? How can they sing your praises, share what you do, and how you can have an impact on your community if they're unaware of you? They don't think of you first for an issue, so that's back to brand recognition and communication. If they don't know who you are or what service you provide to the community, how are they going to engage you? So then obviously the effects of that is lack of referrals, and they may not be willing to volunteer your time, which again can affect some of your other stakeholder areas. And then last but not least, one of the most important ones are your executive directors and your staff within your nonprofit. Lack of engagement can happen when there's a lack of vision or mission and clear objectives. So if leadership or the board is unsure of where that organization is going, the staff can feel disengaged. If there's inequity or inclusion issues within the organization, there's disengagement between leadership and staff as well. And then one of the largest things, and honestly one of the things that we're going to focus on today when we talk about engagement with programs, is when you have a lack of process. If there's not a clear way to do things, that causes frustration. So again, the effects of that are wasted resources, there's turnover within the organization, and then your reputation is affected as well. So as you can see, themes emerge. One stakeholder's lack of engagement affects another, and it's a large ecosystem that's affected within your organization. So with that, I'll pause for a minute, and I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn and let her talk through this. But Carolyn, anything else you'd like to add on this before we go to the next part of the presentation?
Yeah, I think, one other emerging theme that as we were putting these slides together that really hit us was that, when we think of key stakeholders, we usually think of, okay, the executive director, staff, and our donors. We don't, sometimes we kind of minimize the board and the community advocates and the program participants and things like this. But all of these stakeholders have equal weight, I guess is the best way to say it, should be paid equal attention to. And the reason is because the effects of their disengagement impacts the entire organization. We see almost in all of these how funding is impacted, and we also see how reputation and lack of referrals are impacted. So if we don't have funding and we don't have a good reputation, we're not going to be able to be sustainable as a nonprofit. And I think that is one of the largest things that kind of emerged as we were putting this together, was that all of these stakeholders have equal impact, and all of them need to be thoughtfully, thought about equally as you're moving forward with your organization.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. I'll kick it over to you, and we'll talk about what we can do to hopefully problem solve for some of these.
So thanks, Erin. So the next half of the presentation, we're going to talk about measuring engagement. So just to clarify, we're going to better understand how we can collect data using best practices, collect meaningful data to make informed decisions about how to increase engagement. So it's not necessarily that these measures will increase your engagement. It's about how you can use this information to make decisions about how and where to prioritize your time. Because as we all know, working in a nonprofit, we wear many, many hats, and being able to be able to take a breath for a second and prioritize is really important to the success of the organization and our own personal success. So We like to start out with a cartoon, as Erin mentioned before. I know it's hard to measure engagement, but there has to be a better way. So if it were only so easy to hold our laptop up like that and measure it. So we're going to get into, as we start to look at different measures, we're going to think about this by stakeholder. And I'll read through parts of these, but I think understanding when we break it down, let's look at each of the different stakeholders. What are some select key measurements that are important and meaningful when we make decisions about our strategies and both short and long term? And then how can we measure those measurements? So starting with the executive director and staff, there are a few key ones that you'll want to consider as you're putting together your evaluation strategy. And one is overall job satisfaction. Is the ED bought in? You know, do they enjoy what they're doing? Do they believe in the mission of the organization? And then work-life balance. Are they satisfied with it? Are there opportunities to grow? Do the staff members have confidence in senior leaders? What's the attitude and effort? And then obviously looking at retention rates, which I know is harder in smaller nonprofits. However, if you're able to track that over time, you'll begin to see trends and understand if there are different elements that may be affecting that. And then, of course, there are different ways to measure stakeholder engagement with the executive director and staff. One is a tracking database, which we'll talk about at the end. The other is having biannual one-on-one meetings with the staff, which is hard when you're in a larger organization. However, smaller organizations have a really good opportunity to do that. However, and also the one-on-one meetings in larger organizations could be with managers. You could distribute an annual questionnaire, do pulse surveys, and also do some focus groups. So there are different ways to do this, and we're not saying that you have to, you know, that one is better than the other. It depends on your funding, your resources, your time, your availability, but having the opportunity to understand where you are with your executive director and staff will be crucial to the sustainability of your nonprofit. The second group of stakeholders that Erin mentioned was the board of directors. So as she said, you know, we've all sat on boards of directors, or most of us have, where attendance was not great and engagement generally, getting people to volunteer to help out with different tasks has suffered. So, you know, simply when it comes to the board of directors, just looking at your attendance at board meetings, and then the ability for the boards to meet their roles and responsibilities. So how many of your board of directors have job descriptions? How often do you pull those job descriptions out and go over it with the board of directors? I know that I was personally involved with one recently that we pulled the job description out for this particular position. It was for a diversity role. And as we were going through it, that job description had not been updated in years. And when we looked at it and said, oh, you know, this person should have been working on A, B, and C, and none of that was getting done. So how do we want to take action, and how does that impact the organization? So how to measure all of that? Again, a tracking database is really key, whether that's an Excel file or Civic ORS or whatever it is. Just being able to understand and look at over time how many people attended board meetings. And then we also have financial investment as part of that. So most of the boards of directors we work with are 100% giving boards. And so understanding, are they meeting the requirements of the organization as far as the amount to give each year or donate each year? Will be important also, especially for those types of organizations who are situated like that. And then volunteers, looking at the number of hours, the new versus repeat volunteers. social media shares, that one's a little tougher to track, but you may be able to do it based off shares off of your own social media page from the volunteers. And then have there been donations made by volunteers? And then let's move on to program participants. So simply looking at the number of participants, their overall satisfaction, have they completed the programs, and are they willing to recruit other participants? Again, tracking it in a tracking database. And then you could also do some pulse surveys. I think focus groups have worked really well with program participants in the past because you can get them in a room together depending on the types of programs and really get some good feedback that could not only impact, not only look at how engaged they were, but also impact the evolution of your programs moving forward. Fifth stakeholder are donors. So donors play a very central role, as we all know, with our nonprofit. So looking at the amount given, the retention rate, do the donors feel valued? And then do they have advocacy with other donors? So, you know, if one donor is unsatisfied or they have a bad experience, typically they're around other donors, and that, you know, can really be harmful to your reputation and impact your funding or your ability to diversify your funding. And then the final group are community advocates. So, you know, measuring their awareness. Are they aware of your organization or even programs that you have? Are they referring other community members to your program? Do they have a community advisory board who's advocating on behalf of your organization? Have policy changes been made both locally and in the state that impact your organization? Are there any community champions, and are there any participants at community events? Again, all of this, how to measure, can be done in a tracking database. And then we also recommend for the community advocates, focus groups have also worked really well. It's a pretty inexpensive way to bring together diverse community members and to have a meaningful discussion. So now that we've talked about each stakeholder and the types of measurements, the types of priority measurements to look at and how to measure it, there are 5 simple steps that we take to measure engagement because we don't want this to be complicated. So, you know, for those who are not evaluation experts, who don't have an evaluation background, this shouldn't be something that's overwhelming or overbearing. It should be something that, you know, anyone can pick up and do, and that information can then be used to inform, as I mentioned before, decision-making moving forward. So we want it to be simple, actionable, and useful. So the first step to measuring engagement are to identify one stakeholder group of which you want to measure engagement. So when you identify the stakeholder group, is it the staff? Is it the community advocates? Is it the board of directors? Just take one group at a time and pick one to start with. And then the second step is you'll develop what metrics you'll use and how to collect the data. So that goes back to satisfaction, number of participants, things like that. So picking 2 to 3 of those metrics and saying, okay, I'm going to do board of directors, I'm going to look at attendance at meetings and their board giving rate. Step 3, creating a realistic action plan, and then you implement, and then you reassess. And so what we'll do now is give an example of what this looks like in real time, so you're able to see kind of how all these pieces put together. So we chose board member engagement for the example. So we said, okay, we want to measure board member engagement. So we need to identify the metrics we're going to measure. So we're going to look at, have they attended board meetings? Have they attended more than 80% of board meetings? Yes, no. Were they able to meet their board role and responsibility, which means an annual board member review using their job description? And then financial investment. Does the board member meet or exceed the organization's giving pledge? Yes, no. The second step is to set up a data tracking system that can document attendance, annual reviews, and financial investment. So we'll go back to that and look at what Civic ORS can do for us. But another way to do that is also to set up a basic Excel file with these items. Once you've identified who you're going to measure and what measurements you're going to do, you need to create an action plan. And this is like any action plan that you've put together in the past, except we're applying it to this particular project. So we've broken this action plan down, and as you can see, it's very digestible. This is all you need, but basically it's your roadmap for measuring engagement for board members. So we said that we would measure 3 things. 1 is attendance at board meetings, 2 is board role and responsibilities, and 3 is financial investment. So when you're creating an action plan, it's literally taking it step by step. What do you need to do? What's your timeline? And who's going to do it? So we'll just take one piece of this as an example. So attendance at board meetings. Take attendance at board meetings. That's something that needs to happen monthly if your meetings are monthly, which is typically what happens. And the board secretary will be responsible for that. So she'll be responsible for documenting who's at each of those board meetings. And then tracking the attendance in the data tracking system. So whether it's an Excel file or it's Civic ORS, whatever it is, that will help it happen monthly. And we've said, okay, the executive director in this particular example can go ahead and track that attendance. And then review the attendance semi-annually. And we put specific dates in there, January 15th and July 15th. And again, in this particular example, it would be the executive director who would pull that report and say, okay, Jimmy has attended more than 80% of meetings, and Susie has too, and Clara has not. So that's where you need to make a decision. Okay, what are the next steps when those goals aren't being met? And then implementing the plan is basically just setting up a process and a schedule. So however you set reminders for yourself, if you need to go back to the project plan or the action plan every week and look at it, that's great. If you need to set monthly calendar reminder emails, you could do that. So implementation is literally you have the action plan, you have the roadmap, and you're ready to get started. And then reassessing, so that typically happens quarterly and or semi-annually. And when we talk about reassessment, there's a few things we're thinking about here. So one is, are the metrics we're tracking valuable? So you may go back and say, hey, you know, attendance at board meetings is not valuable. We're meeting that criteria. Maybe there's something else we need to look at, or maybe we need to switch to a different stakeholder group and prioritize and focus on that. Is the process efficient and realistic? So we're all very busy, and you know, trying to fit one more thing into our days can be challenging. So are we tracking, are we measuring the most efficiently and realistically that we can? It's not about, you know, saying we're going to measure engagement of every stakeholder group and we're going to fix every stakeholder group and be done. We need to take it piece by piece and know that when we make small changes within our organization, there's a ripple effect that happens throughout the organization. So we need to be very realistic about our time and not get burnt out, and be able to do this in a way that is positive and you know, motivating, and can really help us build that solid foundation moving forward. Are there other metrics we should consider? There may be something that's very specific to your organization that you might want to think about. And who else should this data be reported to? So, you know, if you're collecting data from the program participants on engagement, and as you saw in a couple slides previously, that engagement affects many different stakeholders. So maybe that that data needs to be reported to the staff, or it needs to be reported to the board of directors. And based on their roles for that particular stakeholder or their influence, there may be follow-up items that could happen in order to help increase that engagement over time. Finally, our last slide. We love this quote. It's from Richard Rohr, and you know, it's really long, so I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but it really talks about creative leaders. And you know, our final thoughts for today are: you don't need to be an expert on this. You need to make it very simple and actionable for your organization, but it's absolutely crucial to understand where you are with engagement in order to continue building a sustainable organization. Because when you don't have engagement, as you saw, all the other pieces, it can have an impact on all the other pieces. So creative leaders are a series of alternatives. They're influencing events and inspiring people. They know that one-sided solutions are doomed to failure. They study, discern, and they search together. They collaborate. They know that total dilemmas are very few, and that wisdom is the art of the impossible. They continue to find and share new data and possibilities until they work toward consensus from all sides. They want to increase freedom and ownership among the group, not subservience. And they emphasize the why of a decision and show that it is consistent with the group's values. And as nonprofits with strong values and mission-focused organizations, we'll leave you with this. And we are happy to answer any questions you have, and we're incredibly grateful for your time today. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, this was great, and I think that it's also important for us to remember that lack of engagement and it being interconnected also bleeds into things that are connected can help engagement too, as we unpacked here. What I want to do is take the practical lessons that Erin and Carolyn kind of overviewed for us today and apply it to one of our products, which is Civic ORS Client and Case Management System. Now, some of you may be using something like Neon CRM, and you're going to see that this looks very familiar, and that is intentional on our part. But if you're not familiar with what a client case management system may do, for instance, it's something that can help organize the program side of your operations. We hear a lot about donor management systems, fundraising systems, but program management, things that have very sensitive data, like as straightforward as a social security number, but as deep and sensitive and very important to ensure that it's in a very secure area, like victim services. If there's domestic violence, for instance, this is something that you want to ensure that only the right people have access and only the right people can actually enter and engage with information. And so that's what Civic ORS does. And so what you should be seeing here is kind of that base screen when you log in. And what's really nifty here is you can have those reminders for things like board meetings and things of that nature. But you can also create your own custom dashboard widgets where, let's say there's specific program information that you want to drill down into around race, around gender, around disability, around things that may have happened to the person. Civic ORS can do this, and Civic ORS can ensure that kind of just what we were talking about. If you have very special pieces of data that ensure that only your impact and your outcomes can be delivered and showcased, a lot of times systems kind of give you this cookie cutter approach where they say, well, this is how you should be doing it. Civic ORS' approach is that your program management, your client and case management is special. And so we can adapt it to be whatever you need in terms of the way that the screen is outlined, the placement of the buttons, things of that nature. When you drill down into Martha Brady's information, for instance, the case notes, if we wanted to say, okay, there's a specific case note around academics or domestic violence or a medical condition, these are things that you can absolutely structure and place in any way that you want. And that's important because when you're getting down to it, you're going to want that flexibility when you're doing something like a survey. And so that's kind of what we think is very special about this system, is that it also has that baseline connectivity to the larger Neon One ecosystem. Again, it looks like our other products, so there's a familiarity that even other staff and EDs can have when they're engaging something like an activity. And so even adding something like a new activity to follow up on, any of this is configurable, but our team, of course, has base templates because of the hundreds of organizations that we manage this sensitive information on behalf of, that we can say, okay, look, if you're starting from scratch, great, we have some base things that we can start with. This is what somebody who needs HIP compliance typically is doing. This is someone who does VOCA reporting is typically doing. And then, of course, we can lean on our larger Neon One ecosystem, such as consultants like My Change Agent, to say, you know, I don't even want to get into the tech. I'm not even sure what I'm supposed to be tracking at this point. And that's why we have that larger ecosystem to help you no matter what. So a lot of flexibility here. You know, one of the things that I even love is if you needed to do a custom map and drill down into things and say, look, you know, I want to look at this particular organizational record and structure the fact that, you know, we have a relationship with them for something like we got a grant tied to our programs, you know, or some comments, reminders, relationships. It's going to have this within the system as well. So a lot of flexibility there. But you know, at the end of the day, what we want to do is empower organizations with the tools to help them create that feedback loop around engagement no matter what they're doing, because we can actually tie an end-to-end for transparency for your organization to actually grow. So that's just a quick overview. Again, we don't want to go too deep into that, but a lot of cool things that CivicOR can do, and if you're interested, please let us know. At this point, I want to open it up for Q&A. We got a healthy amount of time for any questions that you may have for myself or the folks at My Change Agent today. There was a question earlier about the slide deck. We can definitely make that available. I thought it was a fantastic slide deck, folks. You know, as we see any crowd questions, one question I have for you is, when it comes to people trying to balance, you know, especially as we get into end of year, what have you seen as the most effective way for people to articulate the impact that they have of their programs when it comes to things like end of the year appeals, for instance? Kind of how do we merge these two sides in a practical way when we're articulating things to the larger constituency that we have? What have you seen that's effective? Carolyn, that question was for you.
Oh, sorry.
Carolyn, do you want to go first, then I'll add two?
Yeah, sorry, Tim. Could you repeat the end of it? I was
absolutely trying to give you a curveball here. So basically, we're going into end of the year, right?
Uh-huh.
And so there's a lot of different things that people are saying, you know, do your end of the year appeals and talk about your programs, talk about this or that.
Mm-hmm.
And while I'm always going to advocate for making sure that you put the donor at the center of the story, how do we adequately take the program impact that we have and translate that into something that a donor would like understand, and if we're going to be gaudy and honest about it, make sure that they care about it for their own selfish reasons of wanting that message.
Right. So I think, you know, donors donate for lots of reasons. You know, one thing that we're doing with a nonprofit right now who's just starting up is we are getting quotes from all of their stakeholders about why they are personally invested in that nonprofit and seeing it succeed. And those quotes have been incredibly powerful. So I think, you know, from a donor's perspective, to be able to garner some quotes from either program participants or even the staff or the board of directors or whoever, whatever stakeholder it is, and really use the power of that to you know, fill your story and do some end of the year campaigns can be very, very impactful.
And it's actually, it's fascinating that you do say that, because in our last presentation, in our kind of our mini series on client case management, we kicked things off with Mark A. Pittman on storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And that same idea came up, and where he actually said, okay, drill it down into one person who basically can best be the representative of that. People don't want to hear about multiple people or large amounts of statistics. They want to hear about one thing. And so
Mm-hmm.
what I think is powerful, even when you're doing something like trying to figure out who that person is good note taking. Something as simple as case notes and things of that nature are going to be key to ensure that you can drill down and find the right person that can participate, because you want them to feel part of the story as well.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
And the one thing I was going to add is Carolyn talked about quotes, and then you talked about storytelling, and I am just a huge, huge advocate of any time that you've got a program participant that's willing to share their personal story and how that particular nonprofit has impacted their life for the better. I mean, Carolyn's right. Donors donate for lots of different reasons, and I can't statistically say that this is true, but from what I understand and what I honestly believe is, when you talk about nonprofits donating, it's from an emotional place, it's from a relationship-driven place, and they want to know that the money that they've donated has made an impact on someone's life in some way. So to your point about storytelling, when you can see that firsthand, I've seen it at, huge fundraising events and galas or appreciation, events where they've been able to have program participants stand up and speak. I mean, that is always a huge way to do it. Or to your point, picking one person with an amazing story, Tim, and taking a video and getting it out on YouTube and on the internet and allowing people to emotionally watch that from a place that they know that what they did helped impact that person in that way. And all those things are great.
And there is actually some good studies on donor psychology that are starting to come out. A lot of stuff is actually from the UK, interestingly enough, when it comes to this. But even when you look at, there was some things done, and I think it was put out in Psychology Today a few years ago, in terms of just like the brain waves of when somebody gives versus like somebody being asked to give, versus just like getting like money, from like a job or something like that. People's actually like the thing that the dopamine actually activates at a higher rate when you give, as opposed to receiving, which is fascinating. So I think that there's a lot that can be said about making sure that there's an emotional connection. That's a pretty big theme that I'm seeing no matter what. I mean, I did a webinar on live stream fundraising on Twitch yesterday, and that's the same thing that came up. It doesn't matter if we're going old school, if we're an organization that's 100 years old, or we're looking at the most, up-to-date tech in the world. It doesn't matter if we don't make that emotional connection.
Well, and everybody's got different emotional connections to different things too, Tim. So people, more often than not, normally are giving towards something that they either believe in what they do, or they've, again, emotionally or personally have been impacted, and they see value in what that nonprofit's doing to help something move forward that they feel passionate about. So
love it. Well, it looks like we're good on the Q&A today, but if anybody does have any questions, any follow-up, please reach out to our participants. Want to thank both of you for the amazing presentation today. We're going to get this up on our YouTube channel a little bit later today, and we'll be following up, and have a great rest of the week. And again, the folks from My Change Agent, please reach out to them. And thank you both to Carolyn and Aaron for the wonderful work that you've done today.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Awesome. And thank you to everyone who's attended today. We'll be in touch.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.